Hey everybody, I'm Sam Gross from electricbikereport.com, and this is the Gen3 The Stride. It's a Class 2 electric city and commuter bike with a 500 watt Befung rear hub motor and a step-through frame. But the best part about it is it's a less than $1,500 city and commuter bike, making it an incredibly affordable option if you're just getting into e-biking for the first time or looking for a cheap form of transportation. But despite that cheap price point, it's a bike we've actually really grown to enjoy riding. We're gonna put this bike through the test today through a brake test, a circuit test, a hill test, and a gauntlet of other tests that's gonna describe how the bike performs in the real world. Let's see how it does. So the Gen3 The Stride is a bit of a bargain at just a hair shy of $1,500 MSRP, and it's actually the cheapest of the four bikes that Gen3 sells, and they're a Washington State-based company. But it's got a 500 watt Befung rear hub motor, and that motor has a throttle and 5 levels of pedal assistance, all of which is limited at 20 miles an hour, making this a Class 2 e-bike. So battery-wise, we have a 48 volt, 10.4 amp hour unit that makes out for about 500 watt hours of energy, and that battery is fully integrated into the frame, and it's a step-through frame. It's a very, very simplistic design. I actually think it looks very nice. I'm a big fan of bikes that just have clean lines. Brakes-wise, you've got some Gen3 branded mechanical disc brakes. It's 180 millimeters rotor in the front, 160 in the back. These brakes seem to stop decently good. We're gonna put them to a little bit of a better test here later in the video. And then drivetrain-wise, you've got Shimano Tourney 7-speed, and anytime I see a full Shimano group set nowadays, especially on a more affordable bike, I get very excited because Shimano drivetrain components have become very, very difficult to get during the pandemic. Fork-wise, you've got a 50 millimeter suspension fork out front. That fork seems to have worked fine, but actually it looks like more travel than that. It almost looks like about a 100 millimeter fork, but it could only be functional down to 50 millimeters. But all in all, this has been a nicely spec'd bike for the price. So to get an idea of how the Gen3 The Stride performs in each of its 5 pedal assist levels, we do what we call the circuit test. And this is where we do a sample lap of each pedal assist level, so 1 through 5, plus an additional lap with the motor entirely off. What this tells us is it gives us a baseline of how well the bike pedals, and then we like to see a nice and measured and consistent jump between each pedal assist level to the next. And the Stride did very nicely here. One thing we did notice is that at PAS 4, the difference between 4 and 5 was very, very small. And this is actually something we see often on Class 2 bikes like this. What that usually means is that this bike can be turned up to a Class 3, so limited to 28 miles an hour on pedal assist, and that last PAS 5 jump in power is gonna make up the rest of that and go over 20 miles an hour. So all in, a great result from this bike. It did put down laps very close to its Class 2 maximum speed of 20 miles an hour, which we always like to see, meaning it's quick. And another thing we've learned about this bike is just how quick the motor is. It accelerates very nicely. It just feels sporty and peppy and fast. It handles just like that as well. So we've been really happy with how this bike accelerates and how fast it goes. So to get an idea of how the Gen3 The Stride goes up hills, we brought it out to our local test hill hellhole. This is a 1/3 of a mile long, 12% gradient on average, with several pitches that go to a higher gradient than that. So this is a very difficult hill, and it's going to very much challenge this 500 watt Befung rear hub motor. So I do have confidence that this bike is going to do well on this hill, mostly because of how it's performed in my test rides so far. This bike is very quick off the line, it accelerates really quickly, which is usually fairly evident of a good amount of torque, which is the most important metric when you're climbing hills. So let's get on with it, see how the Stride does on our test hill. Alrighty, so this is the throttle only test of the Gen3 The Stride. This is the 500 watt rear hub motor. Your guess is as good as any is how this is going to perform on this. It is a motor that, at least on flatland, feels like it's got a good amount of get up and go, and it's actually torquing pretty well up this. So one thing I have noticed about this bike, testing it, is we do get some metallic rattle from the rear hub motor. But right now, I'm thoroughly impressed with how well on just the throttle this thing is doing. This is, oh, there's some rattle. This is the longest, steepest section of the hill, and we are just not seeing a whole lot of slowdown. It's just cruising. That was one of the tougher sections of the hill, and it's regaining speed, which is good because we've got one short little ramp left. And this seems to be the place where a lot of bikes will fail because it's coming into it with no momentum except for what it can regain on this less steep section. But wow, it's clawing its way up as best as it can, at least. Still doing good, man. I'm really impressed. And this is just a 500 watt rear hub motor, or I guess not just, that's a pretty decent sized motor, but we've had a string of bad luck with 500 watt class 2 bikes. And this seems to be not struggling too much. We're home free, it's gonna make it. Hello again. It's cruising. The Gen 3's got it. This is the PAS5 test of the Gen 3 The Stride. And I'm actually pretty excited to see how this thing goes with the help of my legs, because it just put up a great result in the throttle only test. Super impressed. And man, it is cooking. So one thing I'm really stoked about this bike on is it's a step-through frame, but it's a step-through frame that fits for me, which is saying something, because step-throughs are typically better fitting for shorter people, and I'm 6'1", and I can get a full leg extension on this thing, which definitely helps on this test. I can put a decent amount of effort into the pedals. And by golly, this thing is not a slouch up hills. I am thoroughly stoked with how this thing climbs. So the Gen 3 The Stride performed very, very well up our test hill hellhole. This bike is just flat out quick. On the throttle only portion of the test, it made it up in 1 minute 50 seconds with an average speed of 9.9 miles an hour. And on the PAS5 test, which is the motor power plus the help of my legs, it made it up in 1 minute 13 seconds at an average speed of 14.9 miles an hour. That is an incredibly impressive result from a bike that only has a 500 watt rear hub motor. And not only is it a 500 watt rear hub motor, this bike is cheap. It's about $1,500 MSRP. That is a stellar result from a really affordable, not hugely powered e-bike. I'm so thoroughly impressed. One thing I will note is I did get some metallic noise coming from the rear end. It could be from that Bafang rear hub motor, but more than likely it is from vibrations causing the disc brake rotor to kind of very quickly vibrate inside the caliper and cause a little bit of almost like a knife sharpening sound when going up the hill. But aside from that, this thing performed way outside of my expectations. I am so thrilled with how well this bike did. And one last note, something I love about the Gen 3 The Stride is this is a step-through frame, which are typically going to be designed for a shorter rider. I'm 6'1" with very long legs on the tall end of the spectrum, and I can get the seat high enough to get a full pedal stroke, which absolutely contributed to how quickly it went up this hill. I was able to put a good amount of power into the rear tire, and it was fantastic. So awesome result from the Stride, super pleased with how it's performed. So to get an idea of how well this 48 volt, 10.4 amp hour battery performs, we put this bike through 2 separate range tests. The first of these range tests was on the max pedal assist setting, or so in this bike's case, it's PAS5. Then we did a second range test on PAS2, so the second lowest pedal assist setting. And this was to get an idea of how far the bike could possibly go. On the max pedal assist setting, PAS5, this bike went for 21.19 miles. And on the PAS2 setting, this bike went for 40.79 miles. So really solid result from the Gen 3. That 500 watt-hour battery isn't that large. It equals the size of the motor, so you kind of have a 1-to-1 motor to battery ratio there. So an overall really nice performance from this bike. It's not gonna carry you a very long distance, but it will carry you decently far, and I would say far enough for your kind of average everyday ride. So to get an idea of how well the Stride comes to a stop, we're doing a braking test where we bring the bike up to 20 miles an hour and stop as hard as we possibly can and take the average of those 5 stops for an average stopping distance. So I'm not entirely sure how well this thing is going to come to a stop. It's got some unbranded mechanical disc brakes, but I guess they're not entirely unbranded. They have the Gen 3 badge on there, but we don't know who makes them. So a couple notes about these brakes. They do make quite a lot of noise, something we've noticed through our testing, and they don't seem to grab quite as hard as some of the nicer mechanical brakes or even hydraulic brakes, which are known to be much more powerful. But again, this is an affordable bike. These brakes should stop well, but we're going to put it to the test and see. So the Stride actually outperformed our expectations by coming to a stop on average in 15 feet and 5 inches, and that is just a hair better than the average stopping distance of all of the bikes we've tested thus far, which is about 15.5 feet. So a really great result from the Stride and its unbranded or Gen 3 branded brakes. That is a little bit better than what I expected. Sometimes these unbranded brakes on more affordable bikes are a little bit of a mixed bag, and they kind of all can be unless they are tuned properly. So this is one of those components that I really strongly suggest you having tuned by a professional mechanic. They're not as straightforward as they look. And if you do that, you're gonna get nice, consistent stops like we did in a very safe distance. So really solid result from the Gen 3. That is an awesome showing from an affordable bike. So the Stride rolls on 26-inch wheels, which is actually fairly unique among commuter bikes. Usually they're on 27.5 wheels or even 700C. But this bike rolls on those smaller wheels, and I think that actually helps contribute to its snappy handling and snappy acceleration. It's a really nice feeling bike. It wants to be ridden in tight situations quickly. It's a feeling that I really like. Another thing that's nice about this is even though it is a step-through frame, it's actually missing a piece of the frame. We don't get any of that odd flexing in corners that you sometimes get with step-through style bikes. You can make it do it if you try, if you bend your hips and the bars in different directions, but it's not a sensation that you get while you're riding the bike and cornering it. It's got a really nice overall ride feel. The display is nice. It's interestingly actually has the throttle integrated into the display. It's a piece of it that you push down. But one of my only gripes with the bike is actually how difficult it is to read the display. The numbers are very thin. Bright light doesn't do it any favors. I found myself really shading it in order to read it. And then the battery indicator is very small up in the top left-hand corner. It would probably do well to make that larger. The grips are nice and comfortable. The bars feel like a good width and a good amount of rise. Overall, this is a nice handling, very comfortable e-bike. So I personally have a huge soft spot for cheap, well-built, and well-riding e-bikes, and the Gen 3 The Stride hits me right in the feels. I love how affordable it is. I love how it rides. I love how snappy the acceleration and the handling is. And I really love the less than $1,500 price point. It's so cool to see companies building bikes that are going to be accessible to more people for less money. Awesome job done, Gen 3. One thing I also really want to give it a shout out for is the fact that this step-through frame is one of the few that I've ever reviewed that actually fits me properly. I'm 6'1", I have very long legs, I'm definitely on the taller end of the spectrum, and step-through frames are traditionally built for shorter people. This one, however, fits me wonderfully. And it's something that makes me really excited because on that note of accessibility, more people can access e-bikes if they're easier to get on and off of. This bike checks all of those boxes for me. It's not a perfect bike. We do have some minor gripes, and it is also very important to remember that this is a very affordable e-bike. You are not going to get top-tier componentry, you're not going to get top-tier performance, but this thing for the price and for the build has overall outperformed my expectations. I've had a ton of fun riding it. If you have enjoyed this video, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel. And if you want to know more about the Stride, click on a link in the description below this video for a more in-depth review with all of the data that we've collected on the bike. For Electric Bike Report, I'm Sam Gross. Thank you so much for watching.